If you want to understand Indigenous reconciliation, what it means, why it's important, and how to actually go about truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada, then this video is for you. Hi there, I'm Mallory, and in this video, I'll be talking about what exactly Indigenous reconciliation means, why it's important, and what initial steps you can do as an individual to understand this important journey of Indigenous reconciliation. I've put together 5 steps to understand Indigenous reconciliation for you to get a really good understanding of what reconciliation is in the simplest terms possible, why reconciliation is even necessary in the first place and why it's so important, when to take action in reconciliation with Indigenous people, who should be involved in these actions, and then also we're going to go through what initial steps you can do to get a good start. The first step for understanding Indigenous reconciliation is to break down what exactly is reconciliation. What does the word reconciliation mean? Why is Indigenous in front of it? And why are we even talking about Indigenous reconciliation in the first place? This is a really important place to start. The word reconciliation. Reconciliation actually means restoring friendly relationships between two parties. The meaning of reconciliation itself implies that the relationship was working and then it stopped working, which is interesting because many Indigenous people and communities feel as though the relationship with European settlers in Canada did not begin in a friendly way that you would want to restore back to anyways. But moving on, Indigenous reconciliation and what it means. Indigenous reconciliation comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, of Canada, which is a report with 94 different calls to action that was launched in 2015 after years of research that formally began in 2007. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission conducted deep research on the events that occurred in the Indigenous residential school system and research that proved the horrible injustices that occurred to Indigenous people since the arrival of European settlers to Canada. For generations, the true history of European settlers and the creation of the Government of Canada and the treaties with Indigenous people in Canada were all kept a secret because of how horrendous the treatment was toward Indigenous people. So the term Indigenous reconciliation describes non-Indigenous Canadians actually taking action on these calls to action in order to restore relationships with Indigenous people in Canada. Is reconciliation with Indigenous people completely new to you? Are you more of a beginner, intermediate, or advanced on this topic? Please let me know in the comments below. So now that you know what Indigenous reconciliation is, let's move on to the next step. The second step for understanding Indigenous reconciliation is to ask why people should care. Why is this even a topic that we're talking about? Why is reconciliation relevant to you? And why should you care about reconciliation with Indigenous people? I'm going to answer this question for non-Indigenous people and for Indigenous people. As an Indigenous person, why should I care about reconciliation? If you're of Indigenous background, you might think, hey, I do not care about truth and reconciliation. And there might be a few reasons for this. Maybe it's too difficult to even think about the true history of your ancestors because it's too painful to think about, or maybe you don't want to think about reconciliation because it's hard and uncomfortable and you're still trying to deal with the past traumas of your ancestors and you haven't healed from it. On the other hand, if I'm a non-Indigenous Canadian, why should I care about reconciliation? As a non-Indigenous Canadian, caring about truth and reconciliation will help you not be stuck in a situation where you seem very ignorant or unaware. So if this is something that's important to you, then caring about Indigenous reconciliation and learning about what it means and how to go about it is a really good place to start. Now, the following reason applies to Indigenous or non-Indigenous people and why you should care about Indigenous reconciliation. It's important because this nation is one that we are sharing together. Many different cultural backgrounds all share this country, Canada. It's one of the most diverse countries in the world, and that's not going to change. So we all share the same future. Why do you personally care about reconciliation, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous? Why is it important to you? I would love to know, so please share in the comments below. So now that you know why Indigenous reconciliation is so important, let's move on to number 3. The third step for understanding Indigenous reconciliation is to know when you should begin reconciliation, or when reconciliation should be a priority. Well, getting started on your journey for Indigenous reconciliation begins as soon as you have a motivation to, or any level of interest in participating or taking action for Indigenous reconciliation. Now, in saying that, there's also a progression into reconciling relationships with Indigenous people and communities, even if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous background. What I mean by this is that truth must occur before reconciliation. The way that truth and reconciliation is described doesn't imply that truth needs to occur before reconciliation. So it's easy to misunderstand that learning the truth is a fundamental and essential step in Indigenous reconciliation. This is so important, and when you should begin reconciliation can be a very tricky question to answer, because in order to reconcile relationships, you have to learn the truth, and the truth is a very dark place to be in, which I describe in detail in my Truth, Reconciliation, Resilience timeline. But the truth is very uncomfortable and negative, so it's easy, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to feel stuck and unable to even progress to reconciliation the deeper that you learn about the truth of Canada's history with Indigenous people. I talk about the timeline of truth and reconciliation and the progress on that timeline in your journey of truth and reconciliation in my Truth, Reconciliation, Resilience model. If you want to learn more about it, you can watch this video right here. And I also have a workshop specifically on this in my training that is called Becoming an Indigenous Ally. So now that you know the third step for understanding Indigenous reconciliation, now you know when to reconcile, and moving on to number 4. The fourth step for understanding Indigenous reconciliation is who is involved in Indigenous reconciliation. In order to understand Indigenous reconciliation thoroughly, you need to be aware of the different parties and how crucial they are to this. I know there's a lot of Indigenous people out there who are still dealing with the pain and trauma from intergenerational effects of residential schools and colonization. And as a result of this, they carry a lot of fear and anger and negative feelings toward non-Indigenous people. It can be easy to not want to reconcile relationships when you're carrying painful feelings and traumatic feelings with you. When you're in a negative headspace, it will be almost impossible to make progress and to reconcile relationships with the other party when your mindset isn't right. Now, what this looks like many times on the Indigenous side of things, where people are strong advocates and believers in the need for truth and reconciliation. However, their pain and anger gets in the way of accepting non-Indigenous people who are motivated to learn and motivated to connect with them. This is why I talk a lot about gatekeepers and the damaging effects that gatekeeping can cause on both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous allies. In order for reconciliation to occur whatsoever, non-Indigenous people or allies must be involved, and they must be motivated to learn. In many cases, their motivation can be crushed by gatekeepers or by Indigenous parties who are not truly ready to reconcile relationships. Being ready for reconciliation is something that is very personal for each individual. And if you're watching this video to learn about reconciliation for a group of people, such as a community or an organization or your company that's striving to create a reconciliation action plan, then you need to start by getting personal and speak with individuals to get their personal perspectives on how they're feeling about truth and how they're feeling about reconciliation. Non-Indigenous people have to be interested in reconciliation on their own and genuinely care about the positive impacts that it can have. What are your thoughts on the importance of non-Indigenous people genuinely having their own motivations to take action in Indigenous reconciliation? Let me know in the comments. Now you know what exactly reconciliation is, why people should care about it, when you should start your reconciliation journey, and who needs to be there. Now we're going to the most important step, which is how we begin this process. The fifth and final step for Indigenous reconciliation is the how. How do you begin reconciliation with Indigenous people for both allies and Indigenous backgrounds? How do you do this? How do you go about it? First of all, thank you so much for getting to this point of the video. How you go about reconciliation, whether your actions will be personal or actions more involved with your organization, with your community, or your workplace. There are so many different environments in which actions can support Indigenous reconciliation. How you begin is first becoming aware of the true history of Indigenous Canada. Depending if you are trying to understand the meaning of Indigenous reconciliation for yourself personally, or for an organization that you're involved with or employed by, or your professional team, the way that you go about reconciliation with Indigenous people is really important. The first place to begin, I always tell people, is to look within. Look in the mirror. Ask yourself why Indigenous reconciliation is important for you as an individual. This means getting clear on your intentions and your focus as either an Indigenous person or non-Indigenous person. You'd be surprised how natural reconciliation will come to you as you answer this question on why it's personally relevant and important and why it's a priority. Additional actions that you can do is educate yourself by subscribing to this YouTube channel, watching more of our videos on Indigenous reconciliation, Indigenous culture, and how to get involved with Indigenous communities. You can check out the links in the description below as I feature some of our very best videos that will support you on your reconciliation journey. Now, I would love to know where you're at on your reconciliation journey. Please share with me in the comments below. Now be sure to check out this video right here, as it will be extremely helpful for you on your Indigenous reconciliation journey. Now don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment down below, and share this video with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and we'll see you next time.